My claws were shaking when the message came through, and I have not felt my claws shake in 80 years of service. I am Commodore Adrian Vex of the Sci-Fi people, and I have stood in council chambers across 400 worlds without once losing my composure. But the report on my desk made my breathing go thin and cold inside my mask. 2 million humans were dead. The colony of Halberd 3 had been turned to glass in under 9 minutes. And the species that did it was sitting in the council chamber that very morning, laughing. I read the report 3 times before I trusted my eyes. The Krell Dominion had attacked without warning. No declaration, no formal grievance, no procedural notice to the Galactic Concord. They had simply arrived above a peaceful farming world, opened their guns, and left nothing behind but a black sphere of cooled rock. And then their ambassador, a tall, pale creature named Vorth Ka, had walked into the Concord chamber, paid the standard fine of 4,000 credits, and apologized for the inconvenience. 4,000 credits for 2 million lives. That is what our laws permitted, and that is what our laws had permitted for 80,000 years. I rose from my desk and walked to the observation window of my office. Below me, the conquered capital city stretched out across the surface of the diplomatic moon, its towers gleaming under 3 artificial suns. I had given my entire adult life to this place. I had believed with the simple faith of a young officer that the conquered protected everyone, that the rules of civilized warfare made the galaxy safe, that every species, no matter how new or small, had a place at our table. But the humans were not laughing. The humans were not weeping either. The humans had gone silent. That was what frightened me most. I had spent the last 3 days monitoring every human channel I could access, and there was nothing. No protests, no angry speeches, no demands for justice in the council chamber. The human ambassador, a short woman named Helen Carter, had attended the morning session, sat in her chair for 41 seconds without moving, and then walked out of the building. She had not returned. She had not sent a deputy. She had not even filed a formal complaint. The silence from Earth was louder than any scream I had ever heard. My personal communicator chimed, and I jumped slightly. The message was from Council Director Asenvel, my superior. He wanted me in his office immediately. I took a moment to steady myself, smoothed the scales along my forearms, and walked the short corridor to his chambers. The doors hissed open before I even raised my hand. Director Vel was a member of the Thalan species, large and gray and slow-moving, with eyes like polished stones. He had served the Conquered for 200 years, and he was not easily surprised. But that morning, when I entered his office, his face was tight with something I could only call worry. "Commodore," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. "Sit, we have a problem." I sat, I waited. "The humans," he said, and then he stopped, as if the word itself had caught in his throat. He tried again. "The humans have not responded to the Halberd 3 incident, not officially, not unofficially, not at all." "I am aware, Director." "You misunderstand me, Commodore. I do not mean they have been quiet. I mean they have gone completely dark. Every conquered listening post in human space has lost its civilian feeds. Every trade channel has been suspended. Every cultural exchange has been canceled. Their colonies are no longer broadcasting weather reports. Their diplomats have all returned home. Their merchant ships have all turned around in mid-voyage and sailed for Earth." I stared at him, all of them. All of them in 72 hours. I tried to imagine it. Humanity had over 600 colonies, dozens of trade fleets, thousands of diplomats spread across conquered space. The coordination required to recall all of that simultaneously was staggering. It was the kind of thing that took an empire weeks of careful planning, even if everything went perfectly. The humans had done it in 3 days, without any visible orders, without any announcement, without any apparent confusion. "Director," I said carefully, "that is not a species in mourning. That is a species preparing for something." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly my concern." He reached across his desk and slid a small data crystal toward me. I picked it up. It was warm. "You are being assigned as conquered observer to the human homeworld," he told me. "You will travel to Earth immediately. You will report on whatever the humans are preparing. You will not interfere. You will not advise. You will simply watch and tell us what you see." I looked down at the crystal in my hand. "Director, with respect, the humans are a Tier 4 species. They have 8 battle cruisers in their entire fleet. They cannot possibly retaliate against the Krell Dominion. The Krell have over 900 capital ships. This is mathematically impossible." Director Vell looked at me for a long moment. His stone eyes were very still. "Commodore," he said quietly, "I have been alive for 200 years. I have observed 17 species join this conquered. I have watched all of them learn the rules, adapt to the rules, bend themselves to the shape of the rules." He paused. "The humans never did. They smiled, they nodded, they signed the treaties, but they never bent. I do not know what they have been doing for the past 60 years, Commodore, but I know that I want someone watching when we find out." I left his office an hour later with my orders in hand and a strange tight feeling in my chest. I had served the conquered faithfully. I had believed in our protocols. I had defended our system against critics from a dozen worlds. But as I walked through the gleaming corridors back to my quarters, I could not stop thinking about Helen Carter, the human ambassador, sitting silently in the council chamber for 41 seconds. I could not stop thinking about what she had been thinking during those 41 seconds. I packed quickly. A diplomat learns to travel light. My personal vessel, the Quiet Current, was prepared within the hour, and I was airborne before the second sun had set. The journey to Earth would take 6 days at standard transit speed. I spent most of it reading every file on humanity that the Conquered archive could provide me. The files were not encouraging, or rather, they were encouraging in the wrong way. Humanity had been admitted to the Conquered 60 years ago. They had been considered a charming young species at the time, full of energy and emotion, but technologically primitive and politically unstable. The admitting committee had given them low ratings on every metric that mattered: limited industrial capacity, weak fleet, divided governments, short lifespans. The committee had recommended they be classified as Tier 4, with limited voting rights and no veto power. But the deeper I read, the more I noticed strange patterns. Humanity had accepted Tier 4 status without complaint. They had paid their dues. They had attended ceremonies. They had sent students to conquered universities and welcomed conquered teachers to Earth. They had been, by all measurements, model new members. And yet, their industrial output, year on year, had grown faster than any species in recorded conquered history. They claimed it was for civilian infrastructure, highways, hospitals, new cities on new colonies. The numbers checked out on paper, but there were small inconsistencies. A mining operation in the asteroid belt that produced more raw metal than any human city seemed to consume. A research station near Jupiter that had been built quietly, slowly, for 58 years. A series of patents filed by human engineers, all on civilian propulsion systems, that quietly disappeared from public records about a decade after filing. I read the files for 3 days. Then I read them again. And by the time my vessel approached the Sol system, I was no longer worried that humanity would do something foolish. I was worried that humanity had spent 60 years preparing for something very specific, something the rest of the galaxy had not noticed because we were not looking for it. The Quiet Current dropped out of transit at the edge of the Sol system, and I asked my pilot to bring us in slowly under a diplomatic flag. We were granted entry without difficulty. The human traffic controllers were polite, professional, and entirely unhurried. There was no panic in their voices, no sense of crisis, just calm directions and standard clearances. But as we passed the orbit of Mars and approached the inner system, I began to notice things that the polite voices had not mentioned. There were ships everywhere, not battle fleets, not warships in formation, just ships. Thousands of them, moving in steady patterns between the inner planets. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, industrial barges. The traffic was so heavy that my pilot had to slow our approach 3 separate times to let convoys pass. This was not a species in mourning. This was a species at full industrial capacity, running every ship it owned at maximum efficiency, day and night, without rest. And then we reached Jupiter. I was looking out the viewport when we made our final approach to the human shipyards. I had read about them. I had seen pictures. I knew, in theory, that Jupiter hosted the largest human industrial facility in the solar system, a complex of orbital docks and refineries that hung in the radiation belts of the giant planet. But pictures did not prepare me. Nothing could have prepared me. The shipyard stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Lights twinkled across the entire facility, so many that they seemed to outshine the stars behind them. Welding torches flashed in patterns that suggested coordinated work shifts of tens of thousands of workers, all moving together, all building together, all assembling something at the heart of the complex that I could not yet see clearly. My pilot eased our approach, and the central structure came into view through the haze of industrial activity. I leaned forward in my seat. I think I forgot to breathe. It was a ship, a single ship, but it was a ship the way a mountain is a stone. The scale of it broke my mind for a moment. Concord regulations limited capital warships to 14 megatons of mass. The vessel rising out of the shipyard before me was at least 6 times that size, and it was clearly not yet finished. Scaffolding still wrapped its forward hull. Welding crews still crawled across its lower decks. But its main weapon spine was complete, and it ran the entire length of the ship like the bone of some impossible creature. I sat very still. I asked my pilot to hold position. I needed a moment. This ship, whatever it was, had not been built in 72 hours. It had not been built in 72 days. Looking at the scale of it, the level of detail, the obvious integration of decades of design and construction work, I knew with certainty that this vessel had been under construction for years, possibly decades. Halberd 3 had been a trigger, not a cause. Whatever this ship was, the humans had been building it for a long, long time, and they had been building it for exactly this moment. My communicator chimed softly. A voice spoke to me in clear, calm Concord trade language. Commodore Vex, this is Admiral Iona Reyes of the Earth Defense Command. Welcome to Sol System. We have been expecting you. Please follow the marker beacons to Docking Bay 7. I will meet you personally and provide a full tour of the facility. I stared at my communicator. A full tour of what was clearly the most secret construction project in human history. Admiral, I said carefully, I am grateful for your hospitality, but I confess I did not expect such an open welcome. There was a small pause on the other end of the line. When the Admiral spoke again, her voice had not changed in tone, but something had shifted in it. Commodore, she said, we want you to see all of it, and then we want you to go home and tell the Council exactly what you saw. The line clicked off. My pilot looked at me. I looked at my pilot. I gestured forward. Take us in, I said. And as the quiet current slid through the lattice of construction lights and welding sparks, I realized that my hands were shaking again. And this time they were not going to stop for a very long time. The docking bay was spotless. That was the first thing I noticed. In my experience, military shipyards were always slightly chaotic places, full of grease and noise and half-repaired equipment. But the human bay where my vessel was guided to rest was as clean as any diplomatic chamber I had ever entered. The floors gleamed. The equipment was stowed neatly. The personnel walked with purpose, never running, never lingering. It was the cleanliness of a place where everyone knew exactly what they were doing, and exactly when they had to do it by. Admiral Iona Reyes was waiting for me at the foot of the boarding ramp. She was shorter than I had expected, perhaps a head shorter than the average Sci-Fi female, but she stood very straight, and her eyes were the color of polished iron. Her uniform was simple dark blue, with no decorations except for a small silver pin shaped like a tree. She extended her hand to me, palm down, in the formal Concord greeting for diplomatic guests, and her grip was firm and dry. "Commodore Vex," she said, "thank you for coming so quickly." "Admiral Reyes," I replied, "thank you for receiving me." She nodded and gestured for me to walk beside her. We moved out of the docking bay and into a wide corridor lined with viewports. Through each viewport, I could see the great ship outside, its hull lit by thousands of construction lights, its weapon spine running like a black river through the glow. "You have questions," she said. It was not a question itself. "Many, Admiral. Ask them in any order you wish." I considered for a moment. There were 1,000 things I wanted to ask. Where to begin? What to say first? But Admiral Reyes was watching me with patient, steady eyes, and I realized that the order did not matter. She was prepared to answer all of them. She had been prepared for a long time. "How long," I said, "has this ship been under construction?" She did not pause. 60 years, Commodore. We started the day we joined the Concord." I nearly stopped walking. 60 years. "Yes. You began building this on the day humanity was admitted to the Concord." "Yes." "Why?" Admiral Reyes turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had met her, she smiled. It was a strange, small smile, with no warmth in it, but no anger either. It was the smile of someone who had been carrying a heavy secret for a very long time and was finally, at last, allowed to set it down. "Commodore," she said, "the day we joined the Concord, we read the rules. We read every rule. We read what the punishment was for unprovoked colonial bombardment. We saw the number 4,000 credits, and we asked ourselves a question." She paused. The construction lights flickered across her face. "We asked ourselves what kind of system would put a price tag of 4,000 credits on the lives of 2 million people, and what we should do. On the day, a stronger species decided to test that price tag against us." She turned back to the viewport. The great ship hung outside, its hull catching the cold light of distant Jupiter. "We decided," she said very quietly, "that we should be ready." We walked for almost an hour through the inner corridors of the shipyard, and Admiral Reyes did not hide a single thing from me. She showed me the assembly bays where the great ship's armor plating was being fitted, layer upon layer of a metal I did not recognize. She showed me the engineering decks where teams of workers tested propulsion couplings under pressures I had never seen used in any conquered vessel. She showed me the weapons bays where the central spine cannon, an enormous cylindrical structure stretching for nearly a kilometer, was being calibrated by engineers who moved across its length on small magnetic sleds. "What is the spine cannon, Admiral?" I asked, as we paused beside one of the calibration platforms. She looked at it for a long moment before answering. "We call it the Sundering Lance, Commodore. It fires a single projectile, a solid slug of dense metal, accelerated to nearly half the speed of light by a sequence of magnetic rails that runs the entire length of this ship. The slug carries no warhead. It needs none. At those speeds, the energy of impact alone is enough to remove anything in front of it." "Anything. Anything." I stared at the cannon. The Concord had outlawed relativistic weapons during the Treaty of Old Sauron, 50,000 years before humanity had even invented agriculture. The reasoning had been simple. Such weapons could not be aimed precisely. They could not be defended against. They turned warfare from a contest of skill into a contest of who fired first. They were considered by every civilized species to be obscene. "Admiral," I said carefully, "this weapon is in violation of Concord Protocol 17 of the Treaty of Old Sauron." "Yes," she said. "You are aware of this?" "Yes." "And you have built it anyway." She turned to face me. Her iron eyes were calm. "Commodore Vex," she said, "the Treaty of Old Sauron was not signed by humanity. It was signed by 200 species long before we existed, and we were told upon joining the Concord that we were bound by it." But we were also told that the Krell Dominion was bound by the protocol against unprovoked colonial bombardment, and the Krell paid 4,000 credits, and the protocol meant nothing. She paused. We have come to the conclusion that protocols only mean things when both sides agree they do, and we have come to the conclusion that we are tired of agreeing alone. I had no answer for that. I followed her in silence. We climbed a series of lifts and walked through a heavily guarded checkpoint, and eventually we emerged onto an observation gallery that looked out across the entire central dry dock. From this vantage point, I could see the great ship in its full proportions, and the sight of it made me genuinely afraid for the first time in my career. The vessel was named, according to the lettering being painted along its prow by suspended crews, the Lasting Word. It was nearly 1.5 kilometers long. Its forward section was sloped and angular, designed clearly to deflect incoming fire from any direction. Its center was dominated by the Sundering Lance, the great spine cannon, with its barrel emerging from the ship's nose like the horn of some enormous creature. Its rear section was a complex of engine clusters arranged in patterns I had never seen in Conquered ship design. There were too many engines, set at strange angles, with vectoring nozzles that suggested maneuvers no Conquered vessel was capable of attempting. "Admiral," I said, "what is the operational doctrine of this ship? How does it fight?" She thought about my question for a long time before answering. When she did, her voice was thoughtful, almost gentle. "Commodore, I want to answer you carefully. Conquered ships fight in formation. They declare engagements. They follow protocol. They maneuver in slow, careful arcs, and they fire in scheduled volleys, and they pause between exchanges to allow casualty assessment and surrender negotiations. This is what civilized warfare looks like." "Yes," I said. "The Lasting Word does none of those things." She turned to face me. "The Lasting Word does not fight in formation because it does not need a formation. It does not declare engagements because the engagement begins the moment any hostile vessel registers on its sensors. It does not pause for negotiations because, by the time you are negotiating, the situation has already escalated. And it does not fire in scheduled volleys, because the Sundering Lance fires every 9 seconds, regardless of what is happening, until its targets are no longer there." I felt cold all the way down my spine. "Admiral," I said, "this is not a warship. This is a punishment." She looked at me for a long moment, then she nodded. "Yes, Commodore, that is exactly what it is." We left the gallery and descended back through the shipyard. As we walked, I tried to gather my thoughts. The Conquered had to be informed. The Council had to know. The other Tier 1 powers had to be made aware that humanity, a species we had dismissed for 60 years, had quietly built a weapon that could end any of us. But even as I thought these things, I realized the obvious problem with them. The humans knew this. Admiral Reyes had walked me through the entire facility precisely so that I would tell the Council. She wanted me to tell. The Lasting Word was not a secret weapon. It was a message, and the message was being delivered through me. I stopped walking. Admiral Reyes paused and turned to look at me. "Admiral," I said, "may I ask you a personal question?" "You may." "Why are you not afraid?" She considered the question carefully. The corridor around us was quiet. Distant welding hummed through the walls. "Commodore," she said, "I have been afraid every single day for 60 years. I was a young officer when the Lasting Word was first proposed. I have served in its construction program my entire adult life. I have watched my own children grow up in the shadow of this ship. I have not been not afraid for a long, long time." "Then why are you so calm now?" She smiled again, that same small, tight smile. "Because the worst thing has already happened, Commodore. The Krell did the thing we always feared a powerful species would do. The waiting is over. The question is no longer if. It is only what now, and we have always known the answer to that question." She turned and continued walking. I followed her. We finished the tour in a small briefing room near the docking bay. Admiral Reyes offered me a cup of human tea, which I accepted out of politeness, and we sat across from each other at a small metal table. The tea was bitter and warm. It made my throat feel strange. "I have one more thing to show you, Commodore," she said, "and then you are free to leave whenever you wish." She slid a thin data tablet across the table to me. I picked it up and activated it. The screen displayed a list of names, hundreds of names, thousands. They scrolled by in steady columns, each one followed by a date and a location. "What is this, Admiral?" "It is the casualty list from Halberd 3. We received the final count yesterday. 2,147,312 names. Every one of them was a citizen of Earth. Every one of them was somebody's child. Many of them were somebody's parents. Most of them were farmers, teachers, engineers, builders. They had nothing to do with conquered politics. They had nothing to do with Krell expansion. They were simply living on a quiet world, growing food, raising families." She paused. "And then in 9 minutes they were gone." I scrolled through the list. The names blurred together. I had to look away. "Why are you showing me this, Admiral?" "Because I want you to remember," she said quietly, "that what is about to happen is not because we are angry. Anger fades. Anger is short. We are not angry, Commodore. We are simply finished pretending that the rules of the conquered protect anyone who is not already powerful, and we are about to demonstrate very clearly what happens when the rules end." She stood up. I stood up with her. She extended her hand again, palm down, and I took it. "You are welcome to remain in the Sol system as long as you wish, Commodore. We have no secrets from you now. When the lasting word is ready to depart, you will be invited to accompany us as a conquered observer. You will see whatever happens with your own eyes, and you will tell the Council." She paused. "I would consider it a personal favor if you accepted." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Director Vell, sitting in his quiet office on the diplomatic moon, waiting for my reports. I thought about the 412 species in the Conquered, none of whom had any idea what was being built here. I thought about the casualty list still glowing on the tablet in my hand. "Admiral Reyes," I said, "I accept." "Thank you, Commodore." She walked me back to the quiet current, where my pilot was waiting. We exchanged formal goodbyes at the foot of the boarding ramp, and then she turned and walked away across the gleaming docking bay floor, her dark blue uniform soon lost in the distance among the busy human personnel. I returned to my vessel and instructed my pilot to find us a parking orbit nearby, where I could observe the shipyard at my leisure. We settled into a high anchor position above the construction facility, and I sat for a long time at the viewport, watching the lasting word continue to take shape in the cold light of Jupiter. I composed my first report to Director Vell that evening. I wrote it 3 times before I was satisfied. The first draft was full of careful diplomatic language and qualifications and protocol references. The second draft was shorter and simpler. The third draft, the one I sent, was only 6 lines long. "Director, the humans have been building a single warship for 60 years. It violates Conquered Protocol 17. It violates capital tonnage limits. It is designed to remove targets without negotiation or warning. The humans intend to use it against the Krell Dominion. They want me to observe. They want the Council to know. They are not bluffing and they are not afraid. End report." I sent the message and sat back in my chair. The lasting word continued to glow softly outside the viewport, its hull plating slowly being closed up section by section as the construction crews worked through their endless shifts. Director Vell's response came within the hour. It was even shorter than my report. "Remain with the human fleet. Document everything. Tell us what they do. End response." I read the message twice and then deactivated my communicator. My pilot brought me a small meal, and I ate it without really tasting anything. Then I returned to the viewport and watched the great ship for a long time, until the artificial day cycle of the shipyard rotated into night, and the construction lights dimmed slightly, and the welding torches flashed less frequently as the night shifts settled into quieter work. I thought about Helen Carter, the human ambassador, sitting silently for 41 seconds in the conquered chamber. I thought about Admiral Yona Reyes, with her iron eyes and her tight, small smile, telling me she had been afraid every day for 60 years. I thought about the lasting word, its spine cannon catching the light, its engines glinting in their strange, impossible patterns. I thought about the rules of the conquered, the careful protocols, the elegant ceremonies, the 4,000 credit fines for unprovoked colonial bombardment. And I thought, for the first time in my long career, that perhaps the rules had never been as strong as we believed. Perhaps they had only been strong because no one had been angry enough to break them. And now, somewhere in a quiet farming colony that no longer existed, 2 million names had ended. And on the day after they ended, a species we had ignored for 60 years had started painting the final letters on the prow of the only ship in the galaxy that did not care about rules. I did not sleep well that night. I do not think I slept at all. But somewhere in the deep hours, watching the construction lights flicker through my viewport, I came to understand something that the conquered had forgotten in 80,000 years of careful diplomacy. Patience is not the same as weakness. A quiet species is not the same as a harmless one, and a young people who study you for 60 years, while smiling and nodding and signing your treaties, are not learning how to obey you. They are learning how to answer you when you finally give them a reason. On the morning of the third day, the lasting word fired its engines for the first time, and I felt the vibration through the hull of my own vessel from over 100 kilometers away. The great ship did not move. It remained in its dry dock, anchored by its supporting structures, but its propulsion systems came online one by one, in a careful sequence that took nearly 6 hours to complete, and as each cluster fired and stabilized, the entire shipyard around it shimmered with the heat. I watched from my viewport with my pilot beside me, and neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The ship was alive now, in a sense it had not been alive before. Admiral Reyes invited me aboard the lasting word that afternoon. I accepted. My pilot piloted the quiet current across to a small reception bay on the side of the vessel, and as we approached the hull, I began to truly understand the scale of what the humans had built. The lasting word was so large that the curvature of its hull was nearly imperceptible at close range. It looked like a flat metal landscape stretching to the horizon, broken only by the regular pattern of armor plates and the occasional small docking port. Admiral Reyes met me at the reception bay. She was wearing the same simple dark blue uniform, but she had added a small white badge to her collar that I did not recognize. "Commodore Vex," she said, "welcome aboard the lasting word." "Thank you, Admiral." She led me through the interior of the ship, and I tried to memorize every detail. The corridors were wider than I expected. The ceilings were higher. The air smelled clean and cool. There was a quietness to the interior that I had not experienced on any other military vessel I had ever toured. The crew moved with steady purpose, but they did not rush, and they did not shout, and they did not seem in any way nervous. "Admiral," I said as we walked, "may I ask the size of your crew?" 4,012 souls aboard at full complement, Commodore. "And you are the commanding officer?" She paused for a moment before answering. "I am the senior officer, but the lasting word has an unusual command structure. We do not have a single captain in the traditional sense. We have a chain of command that runs 4,000 levels deep. Every person aboard this ship has been trained to assume command if those above them are unable to function. The ship can be operated in full combat capacity even if every officer on the bridge is incapacitated. Even if every officer in the upper decks is incapacitated. Even if only a single crew member remains alive on the lowest engineering level. That is an unusual doctrine, Admiral." "Yes," she paused. "It is also the doctrine that ensures the lasting word will complete its mission, regardless of what happens to me or to my bridge, or to any individual member of my crew. The ship does not depend on any single person. It depends on the continued existence of any one person aboard it. As long as one of us can reach a working console, the ship continues. We arrived on the bridge. It was not what I had expected. Conquered bridges are large open spaces with elevated command thrones and ceremonial railings. The bridge of the lasting word was small, tight, efficient. There were 9 stations arranged in a semicircle around a central holographic display. Each station was occupied by a young officer who looked up briefly as we entered, gave the admiral a small nod, and returned to their work. There was no ceremony. There was no salute. There was only the steady hum of consoles and the quiet murmur of voices coordinating the final preparations. "This is my bridge," Admiral Reyes said. "This is my crew." She introduced me to each of the officers in turn. The navigation officer was a tall man named Henry Lowell. The weapons officer was a thin woman named Margaret Ashby. The engineering coordinator was a quiet older man named Peter Brand with gray hair and steady hands. The communications officer was a young woman named Clara Witt, who smiled at me politely and offered me a small bow. The others I will name as they speak. I was given a small observation chair near the back of the bridge. Admiral Reyes told me I was welcome to sit there during any operation, and that I would have full audio access to all command communications. She also told me that I was free to leave the bridge at any time, but that I should not interfere with any officer or any console under any circumstances. I agreed. The hours that followed were quiet ones. The lasting word completed its final systems checks. Supply ships came and went. The dry dock structures around the ship slowly retracted, one by one, until at last the great vessel hung free in space, supported by nothing but its own internal stabilizers. The shipyard had done its work. The lasting word was finished. That evening, Admiral Reyes addressed her crew over the ship's internal communications system. Her speech was very short. I listened from my observation chair. "Crew of the lasting word," she said. "We have spent 60 years preparing for this moment. We did not ask for it, we did not want it, but it has come and we are ready. In 4 hours this ship will depart Sol system and travel to Krell space. We will deliver a message there. The message will be simple. We will not negotiate. We will not threaten. We will not warn. We will simply arrive and we will demonstrate and we will leave. There will be no second message. There will be no further explanation. After today, the galaxy will understand exactly what humanity is willing to do and exactly what humanity is no longer willing to permit." She paused. "I am proud of every one of you. I am grateful for every one of you. Take your rest. We depart at 0600 hours ship time. End of message." The bridge was quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking. Then the officers returned to their stations, and the ship hummed on, and the preparations continued. I did not rest that night either. I sat at my observation chair and watched the stars through the bridge viewport and thought about everything I had seen. At 0600 hours, Admiral Reyes took her position at the central station. She looked around the bridge once. Then she gave a single quiet order. "Take us out," she said. The lasting word turned its great mass toward the outer system. Its engines flared once, and we began the long voyage to Krell space. I sat very still in my observation chair, and I watched the lights of Sol fall away behind us into the dark, and I knew with absolute certainty that the galaxy I had served for 80 years was about to end. Something else would take its place. I did not know what, but I knew that I would be one of the very few witnesses to the moment of change. And I knew that, when this voyage was over, I would have to find a way to tell the rest of my people what I had seen. And I did not yet have any idea how to do it. The first day of the voyage was the quietest day I had ever experienced aboard a warship. The crew of the lasting word moved through their duties with the calm focus of people who had drilled their roles for years. Meals were served on schedule. Shift changes happened without comment. Engineers patrolled the corridors with quiet purpose, checking systems and adjusting valves and making notes on small handheld tablets. There was no music in the corridors. There were no loud conversations in the messes. There was only the steady, distant hum of the great engines and the occasional soft chime of internal communications. I found this quiet more unsettling than any noise could have been. I had observed many militaries in my long career, and they all had one thing in common. They were noisy. Soldiers shouted at each other. Officers gave loud orders. Crews celebrated their work and complained about their food and argued about everything else. It was the noise of beings who did not yet know if they were going to be alive in a week, and who needed to fill the space around them with sound to remind themselves that they were still here. The crew of the Lasting Word was not making any of that noise. They were, I slowly realized, simply doing their jobs. They had decided, long before this voyage began, that they were going to do their jobs all the way to the end. And there was nothing more to discuss. The discussion had happened 60 years ago in the planning rooms of Earth, and every person aboard this ship had volunteered for this voyage with full understanding of what it would mean. I asked Admiral Reyes about this on the second morning as we shared a small breakfast in the officers' mess. The food was simple: bread and a kind of yellow soft cheese and a hot dark liquid that humans called coffee. I tried the coffee. It was very strong and very bitter. I found that I liked it. "Admiral," I said, "your crew is unusually calm. Even by Concord standards, they are calm. Is this normal among human warship crews?" She thought about my question. "No, Commodore, it is not normal. We selected the crew of this ship very carefully. Every member volunteered. Every member knew exactly what they were volunteering for. Every member made peace with whatever they needed to make peace with before they ever boarded." "Made peace with what, Admiral?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she set down her coffee cup and folded her hands on the table. "With the possibility, Commodore, that we may not return." I considered her words carefully. "But the Lasting Word is the most powerful warship ever built by your species. By any species, perhaps. The Krell have nothing that can stop it. Why would your crew expect not to return?" She smiled, that same small, tight smile. "Commodore, the question is not whether the Krell can stop us. They cannot. The question is what the rest of the Conquered will do when they see what we have done. And we have not assumed any particular answer to that question. We have prepared for the worst possible answer. We have prepared for the answer where every Tier 1 power, frightened by our demonstration, decides to remove the threat that humanity now represents. That answer would mean a great deal of fighting. It would mean attacks on Earth itself. It would mean that this ship and her crew and possibly many other humans would not see another sunset." She paused. "And we have all decided that this outcome is acceptable because the alternative is worse." "What is the alternative, Admiral?" "The alternative is that we do nothing, and the Conquered learns that humanity is a species that can be attacked without consequence, and the next colony we lose will not be Halberd 3. It will be 10 Halberd 3s, and then 20. And then we will simply be erased, slowly, over the course of a century, the way other small species have been erased before us in the long history of this council." I had no answer. I drank my bitter coffee in silence. That afternoon I was permitted to observe the ship's combat drills. The Lasting Word ran simulations every 6 hours. The simulations were not what I had expected. The crew did not practice victorious battles. They practiced disasters. They simulated bridge failures, engine failures, hull breaches on multiple decks, total loss of senior command. They practiced continuing the mission after most of the ship had been damaged and most of the crew had been incapacitated. They practiced firing the sundering lance manually, from secondary control rooms, with only 3 crew members alive in the entire vessel. I watched one of these drills from my observation chair. The simulated scenario was that the bridge had been destroyed, the upper command decks were in chaos, and command had fallen to a young engineering officer named David Kerr on Deck 17. Officer Kerr coordinated the response from a small console in the engineering bay. He gave orders calmly and clearly. He directed the firing of the spine cannon. He maintained the ship's heading. He did all of this while simulated alarms blared around him, and simulated damage reports streamed across his screen. And he did it with the steadiness of someone who had practiced this exact moment hundreds of times. After the drill ended, I asked Admiral Reyes about Officer Care. He is 24 years old, Commodore. He has been training for a moment like that since he was 14. He could perform that simulation in his sleep. So could every other engineering officer on this ship. So could every other person aboard in their own role. We do not have weak links on the lasting word. We have only links. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterwards. We have only links. On the third evening, I shared a meal with the navigation officer, Henry Lowell. He was a tall, thin man with a gentle voice and very long fingers. He had spent 20 years studying jump physics at human universities before joining the Lasting Word program, and he was responsible for plotting the ship's course into Krell space. We sat together in the small officer's mess, eating a stew that I did not recognize but found pleasant, and Henry told me about his life. He had grown up on a colony world called Bridgewater, far from Earth, where his family farmed wheat. He had been the first member of his family ever to leave the planet for higher education. His parents were still alive. They were, he said, very proud of him. They knew he served on a special ship, but they did not know exactly what kind. He had told them only that it was important work, and that he might be away for a long time. "Will you see them again, Henry?" I asked. He thought about my question. "I hope so, Commodore, but I made my peace with the possibility that I might not. We all did. That is the price of being aboard this ship." "Are you afraid?" He smiled, a slower, softer smile than the Admiral's. "Sometimes, Commodore, but not as often as you might think. The waiting was the hardest part, knowing that the day was coming. Now that the day is here, I am mostly relieved. The waiting is over." I asked him about his family on Bridgewater. He spoke of them for a long time. His sister was a teacher. His brother ran the farm now. His parents were old and still in love after 50 years of marriage. He had a niece who was learning to play the violin. He had a small dog named Biscuit who was probably going to outlive him, despite being the older of the two. When he finished speaking, I sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind all day. "Henry," I said, "if you do not return from this voyage, what would you want your family to know?" He thought about my question for a long time. The mess hall was quiet around us. Other officers were eating their meals at other tables, speaking quietly, not looking in our direction. "I would want them to know," he said at last, "that I went because I wanted to, not because I was ordered to, not because I was tricked into it. I went because I believed that what we are doing is important, and because I believed that someone had to do it, and because I knew that I was good enough at my job to be useful. I would want them to know that I was not afraid at the end, and I would want them to know that I love them." He looked down at his stew. He was quiet for a moment. "And I would want them to know that I am sorry, about Biscuit." I did not know what to say to him. I wanted to tell him that of course he would return, that the Lasting Word was the most powerful warship in the galaxy, that nothing could stop it, that his family would see him again, and his sister would teach more children, and his brother would harvest more wheat, and his niece would master the violin, and old Biscuit would sit at his feet for many more years. But I did not say any of those things, because I did not know if any of them were true, and Henry Lowell did not need empty comfort from a conquered observer who would walk off the ship at the end of the voyage and write a polite report. He needed only to be heard. So I sat with him, and I drank my coffee, and I listened. And eventually, he finished his stew and excused himself and returned to his duties, and I sat alone at the table for a long time afterwards, watching the other crew members eat their quiet meals. On the fourth day, the Lasting Word received a transmission from the Concord. I learned about it from Admiral Reyes herself, who invited me to the bridge to hear the message played aloud. The transmission was from Director Vell. It was an official communication from the entire Concord Council, signed by representatives of 46 species. It demanded, in formal diplomatic language, that humanity stand down immediately. It informed the lasting word that the Krell Dominion had offered humanity a formal apology for the events at Halberd 3. The Krell had increased their reparations payment to 8,000 credits. The Concord Council considered this matter closed. Any further military action by humanity would be considered a violation of Council protocol and would be met with appropriate diplomatic consequences. The message ended. The bridge was silent. Admiral Reyes stood at her station and looked at the small holographic display that had carried the words. Then she turned to her communications officer, Clara Witt. "Clara," she said quietly, "log the message. File it for the historical record. No response." "Yes, Admiral." "Continue on course." "Yes, Admiral." The bridge returned to its quiet hum. The lasting word did not slow. It did not turn. It did not acknowledge the transmission in any way. It simply continued. I sat in my observation chair and tried to understand what I had just witnessed. The entire Concord Council had just told humanity to stand down. 46 species had signed the demand. This was the kind of unified diplomatic pressure that, in 80,000 years of Council history, had never failed to produce a response. Even Tier 1 powers, when faced with this kind of unified Council pressure, had backed down. The Krell themselves, despite their arrogance, had paid their fine and apologized. Humanity had ignored the message entirely. I thought, as I sat there, about what this would mean for the political structure of the galaxy. The Conquered depended, ultimately, on the assumption that every member species cared about Council pressure, that every member species would eventually back down when 46 other species told them to back down. The system worked because everyone agreed that it worked. Once a species refused to participate in that agreement, the system could not function. Humanity had just demonstrated that it would not participate. That night I composed another report to Director Vell. This one was longer than the first. I described the lasting word in detail. I described the crew. I described the combat drills. I described the calm. I described the Council message and humanity's silent refusal. I sent the report and then sat at my small desk in the guest quarters that had been provided for me, staring at the wall. Director Vell's response came many hours later, as I was finally trying to sleep. It was even shorter than his previous response. "We did not expect them to ignore the Council," the message read. "This is unprecedented. Stay with the ship. End response." I read the message twice. Then I deactivated my communicator and lay back on the human-style bed they had provided me, and I tried to imagine the Council chamber on the diplomatic moon. I could see it in my mind. The 46 representatives sitting in their assigned seats. The transmitted message returning unopened, marked as received but not acknowledged. The slow-growing realization that something fundamental had just changed. That the rules they had relied on for 80,000 years had just been tested by a species that did not care about the rules, and that the rules had failed. I did not sleep that night either. I do not think I had slept properly since I had arrived in Sol's system. On the 5th day we crossed into Krell space. Admiral Reyes briefed the entire crew over the internal communication system. We were now 12 hours from the Krell home system. We would arrive at the standard outer perimeter, where we would pause briefly for final systems checks, and then proceed inward at full speed. The Krell home fleet would almost certainly intercept us. We would not engage them in conversation. We would not respond to their communications. We would simply approach the inner system, target the primary military shipyards of the Krell capital world, and begin firing. The briefing was very short. There was no inspirational speech. There was no rallying cry. Admiral Reyes simply explained what was about to happen in clear, plain words, and then she ended the message. The crew prepared. I watched from my observation chair. Officers checked their stations. Engineers ran final diagnostics. Damage control teams moved into their assigned positions throughout the ship. Medical officers prepared their bays. The sundering lance was charged to full capacity, then powered down, then charged again in a final sequence of tests that took nearly 2 hours to complete. At 12 hours from the Krell home system, Admiral Reyes ordered the ship to general quarters. The corridors of the lasting word, which had been quiet for the entire voyage, now became something else. Not loud, not chaotic, just very focused. The crew moved with the steady precision of people who had practiced this moment for years. There was no hesitation. There were no mistakes. Every person was in their assigned position within 4 minutes of the order being given. I asked Admiral Reyes if I should return to my quarters or remain on the bridge. She told me I was welcome to remain. I took my observation chair. The bridge was at full staff. Henry Lowell was at navigation. Margaret Ashby was at weapons. Peter Brand coordinated engineering from his station. Clara Witt monitored communications. The other bridge officers were at their posts. The hours passed slowly. We approached the Krell outer perimeter. Sensors began to detect distant Krell patrol vessels far too far away to engage us. We ignored them. They tracked us. They sent automated challenges demanding identification. We did not respond. They sent armed challenges demanding we halt. We did not respond. We simply continued. At 6 hours from the Krell home system, we passed the outer perimeter. Krell patrol vessels began to converge from multiple directions, but they were small ships, not capital warships, and they were too slow to catch us. They followed us at a distance, broadcasting frantic warnings to their command structure. At 3 hours from the Krell home system, the first major Krell warships appeared on long-range sensors. 3 battle cruisers. They were positioned in a defensive arc between us and the inner system. They began broadcasting full diplomatic challenges in formal conquered language, demanding our immediate surrender. Clara Witt looked up from her station. Admiral, the Krell are demanding we identify ourselves and turn over command authority. No response, Clara. Yes, Admiral. The Krell warships began to maneuver. They formed up into a standard conquered engagement formation, the kind that was used in all formal warfare protocols. They were preparing to negotiate. They were preparing to fight a civilized battle with proper rules, proper rounds of fire, proper opportunities for surrender between exchanges. The lasting word continued straight at them. It did not change course. It did not slow. It did not match their formation. At 2 hours from the Krell home system, the Krell sent their final warning. It was broadcast at the highest power their transmitters could produce. It demanded immediate compliance with conquered engagement protocols. It threatened consequences. It listed the names of the Krell admirals who were authorizing the warning. Admiral Reyes did not even look at her holographic display. Clara, continue ignoring all transmissions. Margaret, charge the sundering lance. Charging Admiral. Henry, adjust course to bring us within optimal firing range of the lead Krell battle cruiser. Adjusting course, Admiral. I sat very still in my observation chair. I realized that my hands were shaking again. I realized that I was about to witness something that the galaxy had not witnessed in a very long time. I was about to witness the end of the rules. The lasting word turned slightly, and the great spine cannon swung into firing alignment with the lead Krell battle cruiser, which was now approximately 400,000 kilometers ahead of us. The Krell warships, seeing our maneuver, began to fire warning shots. Bright energy bolts streaked across our forward sensors, all of them deliberately aimed to miss, all of them following the careful protocol of a formal warning before engagement. Admiral Reyes watched the energy bolts pass by her viewport. Her face did not change. Margaret, she said, fire. The sundering lance fired. The recoil shook the entire ship, but the bridge crew did not flinch. The lead Krell battle cruiser, 400,000 kilometers ahead of us, simply ceased to exist. There was no sound. There was no fireball. There was no slow ship breaking into pieces. There was only the empty space where a warship had been an instant before, and the rapidly expanding cloud of vapor that had once been 3,000 Krell crew members. The other two Krell battle cruisers froze. Their formation broke. Their commanders began transmitting frantic messages on every channel they could find. They were no longer demanding surrender. They were now asking, in voices I could hear clearly through Clara's open monitoring channel, what we had just done, how we had just done it, why their sensors had not registered any weapon discharge that should have been capable of producing the result they had just witnessed. Admiral Reyes did not respond to any of their transmissions. "Margaret," she said, "reload." "Reloading, Admiral, 9 seconds. "Henry, adjust course to bring us within firing range of the second Krell battle cruiser." "Adjusting, Admiral." The lasting word turned, the spine cannon swung, the countdown reached 0. "Margaret, fire." The sundering lance fired again. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, the second Krell battlecruiser was gone. The third Krell battlecruiser, alone now and surrounded by the expanding clouds of its sister ships, broke off and fled at maximum speed back toward the inner system. We did not pursue it. We did not need to. We were already heading in the same direction. Admiral Reyes stood at her station. Her hands rested lightly on the console. Her face was calm. "Continue on course," she said. We continued on course. The Krell home system grew larger in our forward viewport with every passing minute. I had visited the system twice before, many decades ago, on diplomatic missions. It was one of the wealthiest systems in the entire Concord. Its central star was a stable yellow giant, surrounded by 12 major planets, 8 of which were inhabited. The Krell capital world was the third planet from the star, a rich blue and green sphere with vast oceans and 3 large continents, and a population of nearly 12 billion. In orbit around the capital world, the Krell maintained the second largest shipyard complex in the Concord, surpassed only by their own outer system industrial facilities. It was the heart of their empire. It was the source of their military strength. It was the symbol of their place as a Tier 1 power. We were going to remove that symbol from the galaxy. At 1 hour from the inner system, the Krell home fleet began to appear on our sensors. 847 warships, the full strength of the Krell Dominion Home Defense Force, battle cruisers in the front lines, heavy dreadnoughts in the second wave, support carriers behind them, long-range artillery platforms positioned at the flanks. It was the largest warship formation I had ever seen in person. It would have been more than enough to destroy any conventional Conquered fleet several times over. The lasting word approached without changing speed. Clara Witt reported a flood of incoming transmissions. The Krell were broadcasting on every available channel. They were no longer issuing demands. They were now offering terms. They were proposing immediate ceasefire. They were promising to dismiss the commanders responsible for the Halberd 3 incident. They were offering reparations payments of 400 million credits. They were offering 5 billion credits. They were offering territorial concessions. They were offering anything they thought might convince us to stop. Admiral Reyes listened to none of it. She instructed Clara to continue logging all transmissions for the historical record, but to provide no response. At 30 minutes from the inner system, the Krell home fleet opened fire. 847 warships, firing in coordinated salvos, produced an incoming volume of energy weapons fire that filled our forward sensor display with a solid wall of red. The lasting word's defensive systems engaged automatically. The ship's armor absorbed the strikes. The internal damage control teams responded to the few breaches that occurred in the outer hull plating. The bridge did not even shake noticeably. The armor the humans had developed in their secret program was unlike anything the Krell had ever encountered, and most of their weapons could not penetrate it at standard range. The lasting word continued forward and did not return fire. Margaret Ashby kept the Sundering Lance charged and ready, but she did not engage individual warships. The Krell fleet was not the target. The Krell fleet was simply in our way. At 20 minutes from the inner system, the Krell home fleet committed to a desperate maneuver. They closed their formation around us, attempting to box us in with sheer numerical superiority. They poured continuous fire onto our hull. Some of the heavy dreadnoughts began ramming attempts. Margaret Ashby finally engaged at this point, using the lasting word's secondary weapons, which were themselves remarkable by Concord standards. They were not the Sundering Lance. They were merely the secondary weapons. But they cut through Krell warships with terrible efficiency, and within 15 minutes the immediate threat of the encirclement had been broken. I sat in my observation chair and watched the engagement through the bridge viewport. I had seen many warships pass beyond saving in my career, but I had never seen anything like what was happening here. The Krell fleet, the largest warship formation in their empire, was being unmade by a single ship that was not even bothering to fire its main weapon at them. The secondary weapons of the lasting word were enough. At 10 minutes from the inner system, the Krell home fleet began to fall apart. Not in retreat, in collapse. Individual ships broke formation and tried to flee in different directions. Coordination between the various wings of the fleet failed. Krell admirals began to issue contradictory orders. The fleet that had stood ready to defend the Krell homeworld for centuries simply could not function any longer in the face of what was approaching it. We continued forward. At 5 minutes from the inner system, the Krell capital world became visible in our forward viewport. It was a beautiful planet. I had visited it before, during a trade conference 20 years ago. I remembered its wide oceans and its ringed cities and the great curved bridge that spanned its largest river. I remembered the Krell ambassador who had welcomed me, a tall, pale creature with kind eyes who had served good food and asked me thoughtful questions about my own people. I remembered a young Krell child at the embassy reception, who had been fascinated by my scales and had asked, with the open honesty of children, whether I felt cold all the time. Looking at the planet now, I felt many things at once. I felt the weight of what was about to happen. I felt grief for the Krell who would suffer for the actions of their leadership. I felt anger at those leaders who had taken 2 million human lives because they had assumed they would not be punished for it. I felt fear for what the next hour would mean for the entire galaxy. But mostly, I felt something colder than all of those feelings. I felt the simple recognition that what was happening because the Krell had chosen it. The humans had not chosen this. The humans had spent 60 years preparing for the day they hoped would not come. The Krell had given them no choice but to bring that day. Admiral Reyes spoke quietly to her bridge crew. "Listen carefully," she said. "The targets for the Sundering Lance are listed in your tactical displays. We will not target the planet. We will not target population centers. We will not target civilian infrastructure. We will target only the orbital shipyards, the orbital weapons platforms, and the ground-based military facilities. We will be precise. We will be patient. We will end the Krell military capacity, and we will leave their civilian population unharmed. Is that understood?" "Understood, Admiral," came the reply from every station. "Margaret, first target, the Northern Shipyard Complex." "Targeting, Admiral, range good, Lance charged." "Fire." The Sundering Lance fired. The Northern Shipyard Complex of the Krell capital world, which had been under construction for 2 centuries and contained over 3,000 ships in various stages of assembly, ceased to exist. The slug passed through it and continued on into the deep void on the far side, leaving behind only an expanding cloud of debris that would eventually settle into a temporary new ring around the planet. "Margaret, reload, next target, the Southern Shipyard Complex." "Reloading, Admiral, 9 seconds, targeting." "Fire." The Southern Shipyard Complex was unmade in the same manner. Then the Eastern Complex. Then the Western Complex. One by one, the great industrial heart of the Krell Empire was removed from the orbital sphere of their capital world. Each shot of the sundering lance produced a moment of absolute silence on the bridge as we watched, and then Margaret Ashby would calmly report the next reload status, and Henry Lowell would calmly adjust our course for the next firing solution, and Admiral Reyes would calmly give the next order. I found that I was no longer afraid. I was no longer shaking. I was simply watching, with the same calm attention as the bridge crew, as a very long lesson was finally being taught to a species that had thought itself beyond such lessons. 2 hours into the engagement, the Krell government finally broke. The Krell First Minister, a senior official whose name I do not remember now, transmitted on every channel an unconditional surrender. He surrendered the Krell military. He surrendered the Krell government. He surrendered all Krell territories outside the home system. He offered to dissolve the Krell Dominion entirely. He begged for the firing to stop. Admiral Reyes finally responded. She had Clara Witt open a direct channel. "First Minister," she said, "this is Admiral Yona Reyes of the human battleship Lasting Word. I acknowledge your surrender. The terms of the surrender are as follows. 1. The Krell Dominion will pay full reparations to the families of every person killed at Halberd 3. The reparations will be calculated based on human life valuation standards, not Concord standards. 2. The Krell admirals and political officials responsible for the Halberd 3 attack will be extradited to Concord custody for prosecution. 3. The Krell military will be reduced to defensive levels only, as defined by an external review committee. 4. The Krell Dominion will renounce all expansionist policies for a period of 100 years, with verification by neutral observers. Do you accept these terms?" The First Minister accepted immediately. "Then there is one final element to the surrender," Admiral Reyes said. "We will continue the demonstration for 4 more hours. We will not target population centers. We will not target your civilian infrastructure. But we will complete the removal of your offensive military capacity. This is not because we doubt your sincerity, First Minister. It is because the rest of the galaxy is watching, and the rest of the galaxy needs to see clearly what has happened here today. Otherwise, this lesson will need to be repeated, and I do not wish to repeat it. Do you understand?" The First Minister was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, that he understood. "Thank you, First Minister. Continue with whatever evacuations you wish to make. We will resume firing in 15 minutes. The list of remaining targets will be transmitted to your command structure. End of communication." She closed the channel and turned to her bridge crew. "Continue," she said. For the next 4 hours, the Lasting Word methodically removed every offensive military facility in the Krell home system. The orbital weapons platforms, the deep space defense stations, the hidden military bases on the outer moons, the ground-based facilities that the Krell government identified for us as part of the surrender terms. We did not target a single civilian. We did not damage a single inhabited city. We were precise. We were patient. We were as good as Admiral Reyes had promised. When the firing finally stopped, the orbital sphere of the Krell capital world was filled with debris. The proud military empire that had ruled this region of space for thousands of years had been reduced, in a single afternoon, to a defensive force barely capable of protecting its own home planet. The shipyards were gone. The weapons platforms were gone. The deep space facilities were gone. What remained was simply a Krell civilian society, intact and undamaged, but no longer in possession of the means to threaten anyone. Admiral Reyes stood at her station for a long time after the last shot was fired. She did not speak. The bridge was very quiet. Margaret Ashby reported that the sundering lance had been cycled to standby. Henry Lowell asked for course instructions. Peter Brand reported all engineering systems nominal. Clara Witt reported the surrender confirmation had been received and logged. Admiral Reyes finally turned to face her crew. "Set course for home," she said quietly. "We are going back to Sol system." "Yes, Admiral," said Henry Lowell. The lasting word turned its great mass and began the long voyage home. The bridge crew settled into their post-engagement routines, damage assessments, resource accounting, communications backlogs. There was much to do, and they did it quietly with the same steady focus that had carried them through the engagement itself. I sat in my observation chair and tried to absorb what I had just witnessed. The largest warship formation in the Krell Empire had been broken in less than an hour. The orbital infrastructure of the Krell capital world had been removed in less than 4. The political and military structure of a Tier 1 conquered power had collapsed in a single afternoon, and it had been done by a single ship, with a crew of 4,000 people who had spent 60 years preparing for this exact day. The galaxy that had existed yesterday no longer existed. A new one was beginning, right now, in the long voyage home. I asked Admiral Reyes if I could speak with her privately. She agreed. We walked together to her small, ready room behind the bridge, where she poured 2 cups of the bitter coffee, and we sat across from each other at her small desk. "Admiral," I said carefully, "I have a question I have been holding for several days. I would like to ask it now, if I may." "Please, Commodore." "Why did the humans build only one ship?" She considered my question. She drank some of her coffee. She looked at me steadily across the desk. "Commodore," she said, "we built only one ship because one ship was enough. We did not need a fleet. We did not want a fleet. A fleet would have been threatening. A fleet would have been destabilizing. A fleet would have demanded a balance of power and the negotiation of treaties and the slow building of military alliances. We did not want any of those things. We wanted to be left alone. We wanted to live in peace with our neighbors. We wanted to grow our colonies and trade our goods and educate our children." She paused. "We built one ship because one ship would be enough to deter anyone who tried to attack us, without requiring us to become an empire ourselves. The lasting word is the only deterrent humanity will ever need. As long as it exists, no Tier 1 power will ever again decide that humanity is a target of opportunity. And that is all we ever wanted." "And the rest of the galaxy?" I asked. "What about other small species, other worlds that might be attacked by Tier 1 powers the way Halberd 3 was attacked?" Admiral Reyes was silent for a moment. Then she said, in a careful, steady voice, "Commodore, I cannot speak for human policy on that question. That is a matter for our political leadership, not for me. But I will tell you that there are many humans, including myself, who have looked at what happened to Halberd 3 and concluded that what protects us must also protect others. We are aware that we have just become the most powerful single force in the conquered. We are aware of what that means. We are aware of the responsibility it carries." She paused. "But we will not become the empire that the Krell tried to be. We will not become the power that takes what it wants because no one can stop it. We will remember what it felt like to be small, and we will let that memory guide us." I nodded slowly. There was nothing more I could say. I drank my coffee. The bitterness no longer bothered me. I had grown to find it pleasant. The voyage home took 5 days. I spent most of it in my quarters writing reports. I wrote a long, detailed report for Director Vell and the Conquered Council, describing everything I had witnessed in technical and political terms. I wrote a shorter report on the human crew of the Lasting Word, focusing on their professionalism and their restraint. And I wrote a third report, the longest of all, that I did not send to anyone. It was a personal account. It was for myself. It was the truth as I had seen it, without diplomatic language, without careful qualifications, without any concern for political consequences. I wrote it because I knew that. In the official reports I would file, much of what I had truly witnessed would be lost. The official reports would speak of weapons capabilities and tactical decisions and political ramifications. They would not speak of Henry Lowell talking about his dog. They would not speak of Officer Care running combat drills from Deck 17. They would not speak of the small white badge that Admiral Reyes had added to her collar, which I had eventually learned was a symbol of remembrance for the dead of Halberd 3, and which every member of the Lasting Word crew wore on every voyage. I wrote the personal report for myself, and I encrypted it carefully, and I planned to keep it for the rest of my long life as a reminder of what I had truly seen. The Lasting Word arrived back in Sol system on the 5th day. We were greeted at the outer perimeter by hundreds of human ships, all of them civilian, all of them broadcasting messages of welcome to the returning crew. The Lasting Word made a slow, stately approach to the Jupiter shipyards, where it docked once more in its enormous drydock, and the construction structures retracted around it as the engineering crews began the long process of returning the ship to standby status. Admiral Reyes thanked me personally as I prepared to depart. She walked me to the boarding ramp of my own vessel, the Quiet Current. We shook hands, the formal Concord greeting, palm down. "Thank you for being our witness, Commodore Vex," she said. "Thank you for letting me see, Admiral Reyes," I replied. She watched me board my ship. She was still standing on the docking bay floor when my pilot lifted off. I saw her through the viewport as we departed. She raised one hand in a small farewell. Then she turned and walked away across the bay floor, her dark blue uniform slowly merging with the quiet professional movement of the human personnel around her, and I never saw her in person again. I returned to the conquered diplomatic moon 10 days after departing Sol system. The journey home was the longest of my career, not in distance but in the weight of my thoughts. I sat in my quarters aboard the Quiet Current and tried to prepare myself for what would come next. I knew that I would be summoned to the council chamber. I knew that I would be asked to deliver a formal testimony. I knew that every word I spoke would be recorded, transmitted across the entire Concord, and analyzed by every species for years to come. I was not afraid of speaking. I was afraid of being misunderstood. I had spent 10 days aboard the Lasting Word. I had eaten with its officers. I had watched its drills. I had witnessed its action against the Krell home fleet. I had returned with a deep understanding of what humanity had become and why they had done what they did. But understanding, I had learned over my long career, was not always something that could be transmitted from one being to another. Sometimes, no matter how clearly you spoke, the listeners heard only what they had already decided to hear. I composed my formal testimony during the journey. I rewrote it many times. By the time the Quiet Current docked at the diplomatic moon, I had a version I could stand behind. It was honest. It was clear. It was as fair to humanity as I could make it without losing my obligation to the Concord that had employed me for 80 years. Director Vell was waiting for me in my office when I arrived. I had not expected him to come in person. He stood by the window, looking out at the diplomatic city below, and he turned when I entered. His gray face was drawn. His stone eyes were tired. "Commodore," he said, "welcome home." "Thank you, Director." "I have read your reports, all of them." He paused. "The official ones, I mean. I assume there are unofficial ones." "There is one, Director, for myself." "I will not ask to see it." "Thank you, Director." We stood in silence for a moment. Then he gestured for me to sit. I sat. He took the chair across from me. He looked older than I remembered him. The events of the past 3 weeks had aged him, in the slow way that catastrophes age beings whose lives have been built on stability. "Commodore," he said, "I need to tell you what has happened in the Concord during your absence. Then I need you to tell me, honestly, what you think we should do. I am asking you as a colleague, not as a superior. Will you speak honestly?" "Yes, Director." He nodded slowly. He gathered his thoughts. "The Krell Dominion has formally dissolved itself. The First Minister announced the decision 2 days ago. Their territories are being reorganized under 12 separate governments, each representing one of the previously subject species in their empire. The reparations payments to the families of Halberd III are being processed. The military officials responsible for the attack have been extradited to Concord custody and are being held in detention pending trial." He paused. "All of these things have happened without further human action. The humans returned to Sol system and they have not made a single additional demand. Not one. They have not even formally addressed the conquered. They have simply gone quiet again. That sounds like them, Director. It does, doesn't it? He smiled, a small bitter smile. The Tier 1 powers have been meeting in continuous closed session for 10 days. They have not yet reached any consensus on how to respond. Some of them want to form a coalition against humanity. Some of them want to seek new trade agreements with humanity. Some of them want to leave the conquered entirely, on the grounds that the conquered can no longer provide the security guarantees it was built to provide. None of these options is being seriously pursued, because none of them solves the actual problem. And what is the actual problem, Director? He looked at me. His stone eyes were very still. The actual problem, Commodore, is that humanity has demonstrated something we did not previously believe was possible. They have demonstrated that a small species, with patience and discipline and the right kind of preparation, can become invulnerable to the Tier 1 powers. The lasting word is not impressive because it is the largest warship ever built. It is not. The Krell have larger warships. The Hral have larger warships. The Yathanim have larger warships. The lasting word is impressive because it does not follow the rules. It is a weapon designed to break the conquered protocol entirely, and it succeeded. And now every small species in the Council, every Tier 3 and Tier 4 civilization, is asking themselves whether they too should build something like the lasting word. And the Tier 1 powers do not want them to. No, the Tier 1 powers do not want them to. He paused. But the Tier 1 powers cannot stop them either. Because if any Tier 1 power tries to prevent a smaller species from arming itself, the smaller species will simply do what humanity did. They will stop trusting the conquered. They will stop following the rules. They will build in secret and they will wait, and one day they will come for the Tier 1 power that tried to stop them, and there will be no defense against it. He paused again. The conquered has functioned for 80,000 years on the assumption that the rules apply to everyone. The lasting word has demonstrated that the rules apply only to those who choose to follow them. And once that demonstration has been made, the entire system begins to come apart. I considered his words carefully. He was right, of course. He was very right. I had thought the same things myself during my long voyage home. The galaxy was changing. The structures that had held it together for 80,000 years were beginning to shift. There was no putting them back the way they had been. Director, I said, what do you want me to tell the Council? He looked at me for a long moment. I want you to tell them the truth, Commodore, whatever truth you have brought back with you. I do not want a careful diplomatic version. I do not want a softened version. I want the truth that you would have told me if we had been friends rather than colleagues for these many years. The Council needs to hear it, even if they do not want to. The Tier 1 powers need to hear it. The small species need to hear it. We are at the beginning of something new, and we will only navigate it well if we begin by understanding clearly what has happened. I nodded slowly. I will tell them the truth, Director. Thank you, Commodore. He stood up to leave. At the door he paused. Adrian, he said. It was the first time he had used my given name in the 80 years of our acquaintance. I want you to know that I am proud of how you handled this assignment. You were sent to observe a funeral. You returned having observed the founding of a new age. That is more than any observer in our long history has been asked to witness. You did your duty. You did it well. Thank you, Asen. He nodded once, and then he left. I sat alone in my office for a long time afterwards. The council session was held 3 days later. It was the largest gathering of conquered representatives I had ever seen. Every member species sent their senior representative. The chamber was filled to capacity. The viewing galleries were packed with secondary observers and accredited press from 1,000 worlds. The session was broadcast live across the entire Concord, an audience of trillions watching from their homes on hundreds of planets. I was called to the central testimony platform. I walked across the polished floor of the chamber, my claws clicking softly with each step, and I stood before the assembled council. I looked out at the rows and rows of representatives, each one in their assigned seat, each one watching me with the focused attention of beings who knew that what I was about to say would shape their decisions for the rest of their lives. I delivered my testimony. I spoke for nearly 2 hours. I did not use prepared remarks. I had decided on the morning of the session that I would speak from memory and from feeling, not from notes. I told them what I had seen at the Jupiter shipyards. I told them about the lasting word. I told them about the crew. I told them about Admiral Yona Reyes and her small, tight smile, and about Henry Lowell and his dog Biscuit, and about Officer Care running combat drills from Deck 17. I told them about the voyage to Krell space. I told them about the engagement with the Krell home fleet. I told them about the methodical removal of the Krell military infrastructure. I told them about the surrender and the precise terms Admiral Reyes had imposed, and the careful absence of any attack on Krell civilians. And then I told them what I had concluded. Honored representatives, I said, we have spent 80,000 years building a Concord that we believed was strong. We believed our protocols were respected. We believed our rules made the galaxy safe. We believed that by maintaining careful balances of power among the Tier 1 species, we ensured stability for everyone. I paused. But humanity, in observing us for 60 years, has come to a different conclusion. They have concluded that our system was not strong. It was merely old. And it was not protecting everyone. It was only protecting those who were already powerful. The Halberd 3 attack revealed this clearly. 2 million human lives were valued at 4,000 credits. That number was not chosen by accident. It was chosen by Tier 1 powers who wanted to ensure that the costs of attacking small species would always remain low. That number was the system working exactly as intended. The chamber was very quiet. I continued. Humanity built the lasting word because they understood, in a way the rest of us did not, that the only protection a small species could have was the willingness to break the rules entirely if pushed too far. They did not want to build the lasting word. They hoped never to use it. They built it as the only honest answer to a question that the rest of us had been pretending not to hear. I paused. And now they have used it, and the question has been answered, and we cannot unanswer it. I looked out across the chamber. Every face was watching me. Every eye was attentive. The question is no longer what humanity did, I said. The question is what we will do now. We have a choice. We can spend the next century trying to contain humanity, trying to limit them, trying to punish them for what they did. If we choose this path, we will fail, and we will damage ourselves in the failure. Humanity is now beyond our containment. The lasting word cannot be removed. It has demonstrated capabilities that no force in the Concord can match. Any attempt to act against humanity will end as the Krell home fleet ended. We must accept this. I paused. Or we can choose a different path. We can recognize that humanity has shown us painfully and clearly that our system was broken. We can use this opportunity to fix it. We can revise our protocols. We can change our valuations of life. We can stop pretending that the rules apply to everyone, and we can start building rules that actually do apply to everyone. And we can do this with humanity at the table as a full and equal partner. This path is harder. This path will require us to admit openly that we have been failing the small species of the Concord for a long time. But this path leads somewhere better than where we have been. I stopped speaking. The chamber remained silent. I waited. I had said what I had come to say. There was nothing more. After a long moment, the Speaker of the Council called for questions. Many representatives rose to ask them. I answered as honestly as I could. I was on the testimony platform for another 4 hours. By the time I was finally permitted to leave, I had spoken more truth in a single session than I had spoken in the previous 80 years of my career combined. Aftermath came quickly. The Concord Council, in the weeks that followed my testimony, undertook the most significant set of reforms in its long history. The reparations protocols were rewritten entirely. The fines for unprovoked colonial bombardment were raised to 90% of the offending power's annual gross domestic product, and the personal extradition of responsible commanders was made mandatory. The tier system was abolished. All member species were granted equal voting rights. The Treaty of Old Sauron was reviewed, and its prohibitions on certain weapon classes were updated to reflect the new realities of the galaxy. New protocols were established for protecting smaller species from aggression by larger powers, with specific commitments from the entire Council to enforce these protections. Humanity attended the reform sessions. They sent senior diplomats. They participated thoughtfully and respectfully. They did not demand any special privileges. They did not threaten anyone. They did not mention the lasting word at any time. They simply acted in every meeting like a member species in good standing of a council they had been part of for 60 years. It was as though the events of the previous months had never happened. The lasting word, having made its statement, had returned to silence. And humanity, having received the answers it required, had returned to being the quiet, patient species it had always pretended to be. I retired from my conquered position 6 months later. I had served 80 years. I had earned my rest. Director Vell held a small ceremony for me at the Diplomatic Moon. There were no speeches. There was good food and quiet company and the warm, easy conversation of long colleagues finally able to speak as friends. I left the diplomatic service with my pension and my memories, and the encrypted personal report I had written aboard the lasting word, which I have read many times over the years since, and which I keep in a private archive on my home world for my eventual descendants to read after I am gone. I have spent my retirement on a quiet island on my home planet, where I write occasional papers for academic journals and tend a small garden of native plants. I do not often think about the events of those weeks aboard the lasting word, but sometimes, in the long, warm evenings when my home planet's primary star sets behind the western mountains and the wind carries the scent of salt water across my garden, I do remember. I remember Admiral Yona Ray standing on her bridge with her hand resting lightly on her console. I remember the small white badge of remembrance on her collar. I remember Henry Lowell talking about his dog. I remember the bitter taste of human coffee. I remember the moment when the sundering lance fired, and the lead Krell battle cruiser simply ceased to exist, and the silence on the bridge afterwards as the crew prepared the reload sequence. And I remember, most of all, the realization that came to me on the long voyage home. The galaxy I had served for 80 years had been built on a quiet lie. We had told ourselves that our rules were strong because everyone agreed to follow them. The truth was that our rules were strong because the powerful agreed to follow them when it suited them, and because the weak had no choice but to follow them all the time. Humanity had simply refused to participate in this lie any longer. They had built a single ship in the quiet patience of 60 years, and they had used it to demonstrate, with terrible clarity, what happens when a small species decides that it will no longer be small. The galaxy I live in now is a better one than the galaxy I served. The reforms have held. The new protocols are working. Small species are protected. Tier 1 powers are restrained. The conquered, slowly and painfully, is becoming the institution it always should have been. None of this would have happened without humanity. None of this would have happened without the lasting word. And the lasting word itself. I sometimes ask after it in my correspondence with old colleagues. The reports are always the same. It is in its drydock at Jupiter. Its crew has been reduced to a maintenance complement. Its weapons are powered down. It is, in every visible sense, asleep. But it is still there. It will always be there. It is a promise kept by humanity to themselves and to the rest of us. The promise is simple. As long as the galaxy treats humanity with the respect that all species deserve, the lasting word will sleep. As long as the new protocols are followed, the lasting word will sleep. As long as no Tier 1 power decides in some future generation that humanity is again a target of opportunity, the lasting word will sleep. But if any of these conditions ever change, if any future leader of any future species ever decides to test what humanity is willing to permit, Then the lasting word will wake, and the demonstration will be repeated, and the lesson will be taught again to whoever needs to hear it. I think about this sometimes when the wind is warm and the stars come out above my garden. I think about the 4,000 crew members who volunteered to sail aboard a ship they expected might never bring them home. I think about the 60 years of patient, quiet construction in the radiation belts of Jupiter. I think about Helen Carter sitting silently for 41 seconds in a conquered chamber, holding inside herself the weight of 2 million names. When humanity's battleship arrived, the galaxy forgot how to breathe. We forgot, all of us, in the long moment of seeing what we had become and what we had failed to be. And when we remembered how to breathe again, we breathed differently. We breathed slower and quieter, and with a respect for one another that we had not properly known before. We breathed in the awareness that somewhere in the orbit of a yellow star, a single ship was sleeping. And we built our new galaxy with that awareness in our hearts. It is a better galaxy. It is a fairer galaxy. It is the galaxy that humanity wanted to live in, and that they finally, after 60 patient years, made the rest of us willing to build. I am grateful every evening of my long retirement that I lived to see it. I am grateful that I was the one chosen to witness the change. And I am grateful, most of all, that I learned what I learned from the crew of the lasting word. That patience is not weakness. That quiet is not surrender. That a species which spends 60 years preparing to defend itself is not a species you should ever underestimate. The wind is warm tonight. The stars are coming out above my garden. Somewhere in the deep dark, in the orbit of a yellow star, a ship is sleeping. Long may it sleep. The end.